This is Edward Segal. Welcome to the Crisis Ahead podcast. Each week, we look at how companies, organizations, and individuals in the news are responding to, managing, or recovering from a crisis, and what you can learn from their successes or failures. My observations and recommendations are based on my experience managing crisis situations and advising others on how to respond to and bounce back from disasters, scandals, and other emergencies. My guest today is Shane Reed, a trial lawyer and author of 3 books on trial-related topics. But first, I want to talk about Boeing and the lessons you can learn from the recent sudden departure of one of their top officials. As reported by the New York Times and other news organizations, Neil Golightly resigned as Boeing's Senior Vice President of Communications. When he was a 29-year-old Navy pilot in 1987, Golightly wrote an article that appeared in Proceedings, a publication of the United States Naval Institute. In that article, Golightly said that women should not serve in combat. Although he said he renounced the arguments in the article soon after he wrote the piece, a Boeing employee recently complained about the story. The complaint led to Golightly's resignation just 6 months after he started his job. The last thing Boeing needed was another crisis to deal with. The company, after all, has yet to recover from the crashes of 2 of its planes in 2018 and 2019. While it may not be fair that someone lost their job for something they wrote years ago and later apologized for, this incident reflects some important realities about today's workplace and culture. The resignation of company officials is just one of dozens of events that can trigger a crisis for organizations. The cause and effect of the event that triggers the crisis can happen in your company today, or it could be months or years before an incident comes to light or resurfaces. But a crisis is a crisis, no matter what causes it. The challenge is for companies to deal with it quickly, efficiently, and strategically, and to put it behind them as fast as possible. That's why if any unflattering details of the past activities of your employees ever comes to light, you should be ready to respond immediately and appropriately. I've written a new book that provides important and detailed advice on how you can prevent, manage, and recover from more than 100 types of crisis situations. Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. Crisis Ahead is now available as a paperback book wherever books are sold and as an ebook from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Crisis Ahead is filled with case studies about how companies and public figures have prepared for and handled crisis situations, and the important lessons you can learn from their successes and failures. The book also includes checklists and exercises to help you get ready for and react to a crisis. You can learn more about the book at publicrelations.com. It's not too early to start preparing for the next crisis. That's because history shows there is always a next crisis, and the sooner you are ready for it, the better. My guest today is Shane Reed, an experienced trial attorney who's tried more than 100 trials. He is the author of 3 best-selling textbooks, including Turning Points in Trial, Winning at Cross-Examination, and Winning at Deposition. 2 of the books won the Association of Continuing Legal Education's top honor for professional excellence. He is the only author to win this award twice. Welcome to the Crisis Ahead podcast, Shane.
Thank you, Edward.
What are some of the lessons you've learned from being a trial lawyer and studying how great trial lawyers persuade in a courtroom?
I think there are 3 things that all great trial lawyers have, and similarly business leaders need in crisis management. And that is, 1, they're the truth teller. 2, they have a clear message with a very persuasive theme. And finally, the 3rd thing is they make complicated issues very simple. And whether you're in a courtroom trying to persuade a jury, or your business leader trying to persuade the media or your employees in a crisis, you've got to have these 3 qualities. And one lawyer I've studied intensively is Mark Lanier. He's internationally recognized as one of the top plaintiffs lawyers in the United States for the past 2 decades. He has continually set record-setting verdicts for plaintiffs against very large corporations. And I think there's no one better than Mark Lanier. And recently, in 2018, he got a $4.69 billion verdict against Johnson & Johnson when he represented 22 plaintiffs who were suing for ovarian cancer that they claimed they got from using Johnson & Johnson's baby powder and shower-to-shower product.
Are the strategies and tactics that helped make Mark Lanier a success, are those teachable skills for business executives who have to deal with a crisis at their company or organization?
I think they really are, and that's what I want to share with your audience is when you're in the courtroom, spinning the facts just doesn't work. And on TV, I think a lot of people think that works. And I think in the business world, people think, well, if I can just spin the facts, I can persuade the audience, whether it's my employees or the press. Well, in the courtroom, the reality is that does not work. Jurors see what the truth is, and if they see you spinning facts, they will hammer you for those mistakes. So Mark Lanier does something really well, but in this Johnson & Johnson trial, the lawyers in Johnson & Johnson made a terrible mistake by not being a truth teller in the courtroom. So the short background of the trial is that women claimed that using the Johnson & Johnson baby powder from the time they were babies to adulthood over about a 40-year period, that the baby powder contained asbestos, and that long period of use caused them to have ovarian cancer when they were later in life as adults. So Mark had to prove that at trial. And at trial, Mark was the truth teller, and we'll get to about that in a moment. But Johnson & Johnson made the big mistake that business leaders also make the mistake in a crisis. They did not admit the problem. Benjamin Franklin has this great quote that I love. He says, there are three things that are extremely hard: steal, diamond, and to know oneself. So that third thing is the hardest thing for anyone to do in a crisis, whether you're in business or you're in the courtroom. That is to admit that you've had a mistake, because you can't solve a crisis if you don't first admit there is one. And Johnson & Johnson at trial, not only did they never admit they'd made no mistakes in their research, their studies, their marketing, or anything about their product, they accused Mark Lanier, the plaintiff, of exaggerating, being overly emotional, making no sense, and they likened him to shouting fire in a darkened theater when there was none. Well, the truth is Mark Lanier had facts on his side, and all the judgment was for $550 million for the 22 plaintiffs. That was to compensate them for wages and everything else. The punitive damages were so astronomical, they were $4.1 billion. That's how mad the jury was at Johnson & Johnson for not being the truth teller in the courtroom. And the jury's verdict and their conclusions were upheld by the trial judge and the appellate court that also found that Johnson & Johnson's conduct was reckless and had a total disregard for the safety of the people. So you've got to be the truth teller. You can't be denial. And if you're a business leader, if you're not candid about the problem you have, there's just no way to move forward, because you will lose credibility. And if you don't have credibility, you can't manage a crisis. So that's one of the main things, is you have to be a truth teller.
Was there a tipping point or a aha moment in that trial that helped win the day for Mark Lanier? Or did he win by simply building a strong, convincing, methodical case, step by step by step?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Mark Lanier always bases his trials on facts, and there were documents that Johnson & Johnson had going back 30 years that had told them that the proper way to study whether there was asbestos was to conduct longer studies than they were doing. So Johnson & Johnson conducted 20-year studies when their own documents and own experts said to see whether there's latency causes of cancer in our products, the studies need to be much longer. And Johnson & Johnson just refused to do those longer studies. So Mark Lanier had those documents, and when the jury saw those, he was able to prove, hey, I've got the facts on my side, and Johnson & Johnson is in denial about the problems they have.
You mentioned earlier that great lawyers make and deliver a clear message in order to persuade. Explain what you mean by that and how that applies to crisis management.
I think one of the key things for any business facing a crisis is they have to have a spokesperson, ideally at the top of the business. And that is the one spokesperson who's going to speak about the crisis and how to resolve it. Mark Lanier does that in the courtroom, and he's one of the few lawyers who does that. And what do I mean by that? In a 6-week trial, in this Johnson & Johnson case, where he's representing 22 plaintiffs, that's just an unheard of amount of plaintiffs to have in one courtroom. Usually it's 3 or 4. He's got 22. Mark Lanier does the whole trial by himself. He's got a huge team of support, but all the jury sees is Mark Lanier doing every opening, direct, cross, and closing argument. He is the one messenger to deliver his clear message. And the reason he does that is he wants to be the one single spokesperson that the jury looks to trust and for credibility. On the other side, in the Johnson & Johnson trial and trials throughout the country, these big companies divide up the responsibility against multiple lawyers. So one lawyer does the opening, one does direct, another does the cross, on and on for 6 weeks. The jury doesn't know who is going to stand up next for the defense, for the company, and deliver the next message. So we get inconsistencies, we get different personalities, and naturally, if you have different lawyers, they're going to emphasize different facts. The same is true for businesses facing a crisis. If you have multiple people giving your message, they are naturally going to say things differently, whether by the facts they say or the tones they use. So I think it's key for businesses to learn from trial lawyers that it is best to have one single person deliver the message.
Aside from having one person at a company be the point person for communications during a crisis, what else can business executives learn about how to make a clear, simple, and persuasive message during that crisis?
What I teach, what Mark Lanier does better than anyone I've seen, is that he understands the science of confirmation bias. So the idea of confirmation bias is that if you present an audience with an idea, they will naturally look for things in their history that support that idea rather than facts that don't support it. So they will look for facts in their past that confirm the theme or message you've put out there. And doubly, they will subsequently view facts that support your theme that are in the future. So let me give you an example of this, Edward. If I were to tell you that this pandemic of COVID-19 has created a lot of opportunities, you would immediately think to the positive things that support that idea, such as more time spent with family, the ability to live in the moment and slow down, or maybe the opportunity to pick up a new hobby that you hadn't had time to do before. So you would confirm through the bias of the theme that I've presented to you that COVID-19 has presented opportunities. On contrast, if I told you, Edward, hey, COVID-19 has presented a lot of lost opportunities and has been terrible, you would immediately think about the people who got ill, people that died, the lost opportunities at work, maybe people who've lost jobs, lost income. On the family side, it might be the lost vacation you'd planned or the lost money you couldn't get back from that vacation. You would confirm through your history the idea I presented to you. So it's the same facts, but it's all built around confirmation bias of the idea you present. So business leaders need to have a clear theme so that they can take advantage of this idea of confirmation bias. I'll give you an example in just a minute. But at the trial, Mark Lanier in this Johnson & Johnson case, he had a great, simple thing. He told the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is as simple as A, B, C. That is, asbestos, when absorbed into the body, causes cancer. It was a simple message. It was clear, and he ran with it throughout the trial till he got his verdict. On the other side, Johnson & Johnson had different themes, different messages, and never had a clear one that could take advantage of this idea of confirmation bias. And if you'll notice, what Mark Lanier did was he used the rule of 3, which is having 3 ideas in your message.
Shane, can you give us a couple more examples of how lawyers can make complicated issues simple to understand for jurors, and how that technique can be used by business executives during a crisis?
Edward, that's a great question. Einstein once said, if you don't If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So what happens is business leaders get lost in the details in a crisis, and they don't explain their message clearly. Great lawyers know how to do that. So here's what I teach. I teach the rule of three. Let's make our message framed in the idea of three ideas. That's because people understand that better. Edward, if I told you I've got 22 ways to solve a crisis, you would just immediately fog over and stop listening. But if I said I give you three solutions to the problem, you'd immediately be more receptive to that. It's built in our DNA and throughout our life. The idea of the rule of three just has a ring of simplicity and ease to it. So let me give you an example. If you were a business leader and you were faced with a crisis, your message using the rule of three could be something as simple as using alliteration to make your three ideas. We recognize the problem, we have responded to it, and we're ready to move forward. I love using the idea of alliteration in the rule of three because it's easy to remember. Another way a business could use it is that if they're in a crisis, they could say, we are firmly committed to the safety of our employees and our customers. We are going to be flexible during this COVID-19 epidemic. And finally, with all certainty, we are going to move forward no matter what the challenges are. So those are two examples that business can use today in responding to the crisis that take advantage of this rule of three, using alliteration to have a clear message and to make the complicated ideas simple. And that's what exactly Mark Lanier does in all his trials. In another trial that was very complicated, he told the jurors, this is a case about plaintiffs who trusted a doctor, trusted a product, and they got terrible results.
Well, I'm afraid we're almost out of time, Shane. How can people learn more about you and the books that you've written?
They can go to my website, shaneread.com. It's ShaneRead.com. And I think the book they most enjoy in the business world is Turning Points at Trial, where I examine how 13 famous lawyers had these large trials and had a turning point using the ideas we talked about today.
Thanks, Shane, for joining me today. My guest today has been Shane Read, an experienced trial attorney who has tried more than 100 trials. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Edward, very much.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Crisis Ahead podcast. Remember, it's not a matter of if companies and organizations will have a crisis, but when.